Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be going over what is an ideal government for most people. Pretty big question. I think most people have some idea of what that looks like in their head, because at some point I'm sure you have thought about this concept. And so I wanted to outline firstly kind of what people want when we're talking about what they find as to be ideal, and then we'll get into like the history of things and kind of go from there. And then towards the end, we'll end with what an ideal government should probably look like if we could design one. So, firstly, I think what people want is pretty simple concept, and that concept being they want to have their freedoms not be infringed by certain other people or bodies of government. And some of the stuff's gonna be broad, and we'll get into specifics later. But just as a general thing, I would say freedom is a big thing. How you define that again is more detail oriented, but just broadly, I'd say freedom. The next thing I would say is a fair justice system for dealing with freedoms being infringed on would be the next thing. I also feel like people don't want to be controlled. Let's say a lack of absolute control over oneself via a government body or some outside source is a pretty big deal for a lot of people. Again, that goes in tandem with freedom. It's kind of like the opposite of what freedom is. Would be someone else having control over you. Now, people can argue all day about the specifics of freedom. And we do that to this day, and it's an ongoing thing. Basically, it's like you ask the question, okay, how much freedom is too much freedom, and what is the line if we start taking away certain freedoms? Where do we stand on that? Because there needs to be some sort of middle ground in between having too much control over someone and too little control. So there's this middle ground that we are constantly having to meet as a society. And I'm mostly referencing the United States government just because that's where I live. So I'll just use the US as an example, but we're constantly trying to find the middle ground to these problems that we have. And all of these things are societal issues. It's more or less what's socially acceptable. How would you define that? And what might be socially acceptable to me is going to be different for you and the next person and the next person. There's going to be groups of people who agree with certain aspects of and concepts versus other people. And then that's how you get different parties. You got the Democrats, and then you got the Republicans, and then you got all sorts of other political parties in between. I think ideally what people are trying to look for is that perfect middle ground. And it's very hard because at the end of the day, every single person on this planet is uniquely different from one another. We can categorize ourselves into different groups, and these groups can share similar opinions. But when you go around the table far enough, these subtle differences start to become grander differences, and then that's where you create a lot of division, right? So in a country like the US, when there's over 300 million people, that's a very, very large table with very large different ideas, and from one end of the table to the other is going to be like a complete 180. Some are like really extreme in this area, and others are not. And then you got people who are kind of in between that, but then across the table from them, it seems extreme to others. It's very, very complex. It's not just like this thing that we can solve overnight. If that was the case, we would have done that. And I think over time, we've done our best to try to rectify this issue of, okay, this isn't working for most people. It's been working for a select few, and they benefit a lot, but we're kind of tired of that. So how do we get the most people to be able to benefit from most of these systems being in place, if that makes sense? So there's a very rich complexity to this, and there isn't going to be just one real answer. It's going to be more broad, and then we have to just fill in the blanks from there. That's really the only way to tackle this issue from what I see. Keeping all this in mind, we have to go into this subject open-mindedly because, again, everyone's going to have a different opinion on this, everyone. At the end of the day, I think, like I had outlined before, on basic freedoms and not having so many restrictions and having a good justice system to deal with these things is at the root of what we really want. So just keep that in mind going forward. Anyways, let's take a brief look into history a little bit so we can reflect on the different types of governments that have happened on this planet, and we can kind of gather the evidence-based situations and compare them to nowadays and what's working and what's not. Right? So if we want solutions to things, we typically have to peer into history to see what worked and what didn't. So we'll begin that journey, starting with ancient civilizations. Most of them, not all, but most of them, and I'm talking ancient as in anything that's well over 2,000 years old from today's date. Civilizations like ancient Egypt and the Romans, which Egypt is actually 2,000 years even before the Romans, but kind of in that area, right, where 2,000 years ago, anywhere BC. Civilizations like that mostly operated with one figurehead ruler, so a monarchy, right? And by definition, if you look into the Britannica definition, a monarchy is a political system based upon the undivided sovereignty or rule of a single person. The term applies to states in which supreme authority is vested in the monarch, an individual ruler who functions as the head of state and who achieves his or her position through heredity. Most monarchies allow only male succession, usually from father to son. So it's usually a hereditary thing where it's just passed on from father to son, or mother to son, or mother to a daughter. It's usually hereditary. It doesn't have to be. Now, something that you'll notice, and what I've noticed with my research on the different types of governments, is that there's a lot of overlap between definitions, and to this day it's still a problem, which I don't really understand. Like, it's kind of, some government types are intermingled with others, and it's just really convoluted. So it's really frustrating because we'll get into this later, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyways, so monarchies usually was the dominant form of government in that era of 2,000 plus years ago. And okay, so what worked, what didn't? Well, The thing about a monarchy, when you have one person in charge, no matter whether they're considered a good or evil person, things can get expedited very, very quickly. Right? So, if Caesar of Rome, which I know he was kind of transitioning basically into that, and then after he died, it basically became a monarchy again, with like Augustus and those guys. But maybe Augustus would be a better example. I'll just use him. You're able to, as Augustus, expedite processes basically instantly. If he wanted, he could go to war with another country that day. He could start preparing troops to send them over to do this. If he wanted to start focusing more on agriculture, it would happen overnight. At least the process of starting these things would happen. He doesn't have to go through a chain of command. There's no like other powers that he has to go through or have to go through him. It's just he says we're working on this, and then that immediately becomes the focus. Whereas in other government types that have more figureheads involved, more people in charge of certain aspects of the government, or when it's a balance of different branches, kind of like what the U.S. has, it's a more bureaucratic system, so things take time to happen. So if they wanted to increase the budget for schooling, that's going to take some time. That could take months or even years for that to go through. Whereas Augustus could increase the budget for public schools instantly. Again, it's a faster process. Modern examples of this expedition process would be like Russia, China, North Korea, which are dictatorships by more or less the definition. They're not communism. They don't have a communism government. They like to slap the label on their government as communist, but they're not. It's a freaking dictatorship through and through. You have a group of people who have a lot of control, if not most control, over the entire country. And North Korea is a little bit more extreme. I think they would be more either totalitarianism or authoritarianism, where they even try to control people's like thoughts, and they just having absolute control over someone basically. So they're a bit more extreme on that end. So there's a spectrum within the monarchy government types. There's a bunch of subtypes, but anyways, someone like Putin can expedite things very quick. He can be like, all right, we need upgraded nuclear missile systems. That's what I want to focus our manpower on. And boom, just like that. They start the project tomorrow. Or whenever he wants it. Could be in the middle of the night, who knows. So versus governments that are more bureaucratic, there's more quote-unquote paperwork that needs to be done, or just more peer review work, such as United States, which is, if you want to go, there's different definitions to what the United States would be considered. And I think the best way to put it would be constitutional republic being probably the best definition for what the United States is, because it's a republic, which is a very loose definition. I mean, basically any country nowadays can be considered a republic. I think even like North Korea can be considered a republic, and that's what they refer to themselves as. People just use the word republic thrown out. That's the kind of problem that we're gonna run into with these definitions, which is really annoying. So, by definition, this is according to Britannica. It's a republic, form of government in which a state is ruled by representatives of a citizen body. Modern republics are founded on the idea that sovereignty rests with the people, so power with the people, though who is included and excluded from the category of the people has varied across history, because citizens do not govern the state themselves, but through representatives, usually. Republics may be distinguished from direct democracies, though modern representative democracies are by and large republics. The term republic may also be applied to any form of government in which the head of state is not a hereditary monarch. So, what the fuck is a republic by those definitions, right? And then you go further down into the page, and it says, despite its democratic implications, the term was claimed in the 20th century by states whose leadership enjoyed more power than most traditional monarchs, including military dictatorships such as the Republic of Chile under Augusto Pinochet, and totalitarian regimes such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Again, the the definition for republic is so muddy that it just almost could mean anything, and it just doesn't matter what you call your form of government. You could just throw in the word republic and make it sound a little cooler, I suppose. But anyways, so typically a republic is a system in which democracy also takes place, and the definition of democracy and republic kind of intermingle, so they're kind of, it's a mess. So if we want to take a look at what the definition is, if we go to the Merriam-Webster and you type in democracy or republic, the question is the United States a democracy or a republic? This is one of those either or questions that seem like it should have a straightforward answer. After all, two such different words must have two different definitions, right? The short answer is that democracy and republic are frequently used to mean the same thing: a government in which the people vote for their leaders. This was the important distinction at the time of the founding of the United States, in direct contrast with the ruler of a king or monarchy in Great Britain, in part that because that context was clear to everyone involved in the American Revolution. These terms were used interchangeably in the late 1700s. Both democracy and republic meant that the power to govern was held by the people rather than a monarch. It was just an easy way to distinct, okay, we are not this. So we're a republic, we're a democracy, we're both. The United States is constitutionally backed because, okay, so there are, yes, you can vote, it's a democracy, but you cannot change the fundamentals of the Constitution without amendments. But there are certain core, in what our founding fathers would consider inalienable rights that were given to us at birth that should not be stripped away. Like, we are all, again, what I was talking about, certain freedoms and all these kinds of things. So you can't infringe on those. No matter what you try to vote in, it prevents the what's supposed to be the core of the United States from being changed so much that it's indistinguishable, right? It's supposed to basically protect everyone at its core with certain rights. So you can't vote out certain freedoms. Oh, you can't vote in, like, oh, all people of this race or color who are American citizens should be eradicated. That cannot happen ever. So things like that, which I think is a great system. Anyways, going back to the pros of having one ruler or a small group of rulers is that things can get done much faster versus a bureaucratic system where if you want something done, it's going to take a little bit more time. So with things, what we're dealing with is like regulation with AI. We have to implement systems now if we really want them to go into full effect in the next 10, 20 years, whatever. It's one of those, you have to think ahead type of things versus you don't have to do that with absolute control and power with governments such as monarchies and dictatorships. It can be a pro and a con. It really just depends on who's running these governments. If you have someone who is inherently evil in a monarchy type government, then they're going to expedite things to make your life worse. So things can turn really bad overnight. Whereas in a constitutional republic like the United States, it's a slow process to make your life worse. And I'm not going to lie, we're seeing the effects of this now from years and decades before, things that were implemented and have now infected the system now to a point where it's making certain people's lives harder, right? So there's a delay, is what I'm saying. So it just kind of depends on who's running the thing, I suppose, for you to be able to take it as, is this good or a bad thing? I don't know. It really just depends, right? Is the question you should be asking yourself. There's no real right or wrong. There have been excellent monarchy type leaders back in the day. So one example that I can give is Nero of Rome. And if you know him, okay, you probably are thinking, what are you talking about? He was a complete sadistic asshole. He was egocentric. He had a god complex, all this stuff. Well, recenter findings have found that Nero was actually a really great guy. He didn't play the harp while Rome was burning and he was laughing maniacally. That was fairy tale. A lot of the stuff that's talked about him in a bad light was actually just made up by the ultra rich, the wealthy Romans, because they didn't like what he was doing. Now, again, they're finding evidence of this stuff through diary entries from just normal citizens of the day who were literate and could read and write. Their story tells a different story than what we have been painted, because most historians, most things. I mean, if you look at any history book that was written like 10 years ago, and I don't know if they've revised these things recently, but they all paint Nero in a very bad light. He was sadistic. He was all these things. As new information is unfolded, we are rewriting history to show that he wasn't that way, possibly, and that he was actually doing a lot of good for the common citizen. He was making bathhouses and public workspaces for people, for the common person, to be able to enjoy. So he was using a lot of taxpayer money, especially the rich, which I don't know how much he slighted them, but he seemed to have really pissed them off, obviously, to the point where they tried to rewrite history. And they more or less succeeded because for the longest time, everyone thought he was an asshole. So I'm not entirely sure what he did to piss them off. I think he was, I don't know if he was either trying to stick it to the rich and he just felt really bad for the poor. So a lot of his focuses was on how do I benefit the majority, not the minority, and the elite at the time just did not like that. They, I don't know if he took away parts of what was supposed to be their land, what was their land, and he just took it away, or they just didn't like that his focus was so much on the common person. Either way, so if he was truly a great leader, then you could have a system like that and make it work, so long as the next person in line who's going to take over is more or less the same type of person, a good ethical person with a good moral compass, and isn't here for their own benefit and the benefit of the few. They're trying to make the most people benefit from their decisions. Again, that's assuming that Nero actually was a good person, which in my opinion, it seems like that's the direction that it's heading in the history books from documentaries that I've seen. You can look into it yourself. I would encourage you to, but that's what I've gathered from it. Anyways, just like anything, it's possible to have good out of a system that may seem a little terrifying at first. So, a monarchy in today's standards seems like an absolute nightmare because, well, we're not used to that, especially those of us living in a systematic government that has a lot of pieces to it. A monarchy seems a little out of the conventional way of thinking. It seems a very old way. Well, if we had someone modern today who was objectively good and they tried to push objectively good agendas and they were genuinely trying to take care of as many people as possible, you could have that person in a position of absolute power, like an autocrat or a dictator, and be just fine. The problem is succession, and that's where throughout history empires rise and fall, because it depends on who is leading the country. They can you get enough bad, you roll the dice enough times, and you get enough bad leaders, they can crash and burn the entire empire to the ground. That's happened. You can have just the right mix of good and bad, where like the Roman Empire, it was able to last a very long time because they had just the right mix of good and bad. It was a tug of war, and then someone really bad really messed things up. And then someone good would come along and fix all the messes that other person created, and it's just this back and forth. It's not always up to the inner workings of a government, though. You can have a string of great leaders and still crumble with outside sources coming into play. So a neighboring country that you have a pissing match with and you just don't get along with them, they could just come in and destroy half your country and then destroy your economy and destroy what made your empire so great. And then you become dysfunctional, you go into anarchy, and then you collapse. So it's not always completely determined by the government itself. There's a lot of other variables that play into why a empire can work and why it can't. I would also say the keys to success for an empire also lies within its populace, right? The people that live amongst it. And I would say generally, if the less oppression and the less restrictions of freedoms that you place on your citizens, you give them more freedoms, you're not oppressing them constantly, the more growth that can be had, because you're going to have individuals that can greatly advance your civilization, your empire, into whole new levels with their ideas and their application of these ideas that can, again, elevate your empire into a powerhouse technologically and militarily. So I would say generally, empires that do succeed the most are the ones that keep their population less oppressed. So if you have more good leaders present running the empire generation after generation, you will typically grow a much more powerful empire over time as well. The next thing, well, we'll go into the next type of government, I suppose, and that being, so a true democracy, whereas, okay, the United States isn't the truest form of democracy, especially by today's standards, but even on its intended purpose with our founding fathers, it is not a true democracy. So a true democracy would be like if a group of people voted on something, you have majority vote that overrules every time. It's just majority rules. That's by definition really what democracy is. It's just whoever casts the most votes, whatever they're voting on, gets passed through. So the sadistic example of this would be, let's go back in time to witch trials. And if 9 out of 10 people believed, without sufficient evidence at all, that this person is a witch, and they want them to get stoned to death, if 9 out of 10 people vote that they want that to happen, it will happen. That's the problem with a true democracy. There's no filters, whereas the Constitution of the United States would protect people from something like that happening. No matter how many votes get cast into the hat, you cannot stone someone to death without sufficient evidence. You have to have evidence for that. The Constitution protects people from unjustly acts, right? There's a safety net, so it can't just get out of control. Again, you could start to reshape an entire government based off of people's pure votes. If you're just going off of what did the majority vote, it's not a great system. We've learned that over history. You can't just, because of those reasons, you can't just have, because just because the majority feels a certain way about something does not make it right. And that's the philosophy behind that. So, a true democracy doesn't work if you want to incorporate the fairness factor in there, because it can't be fair. It just really depends on the majority. It depends on that group that I talked about at the beginning, where you have those 9 out of 10 people just so happen to be very gullible, because 2 out of the 10 were just blatantly lying. They don't like this person at all. Maybe she slept with their friend, and they got jealous, and so they told the story that she's a witch. They saw her doing witch things, and because the other 7 out of 10 are extremely gullible, that's just who they are, that's just in their personality, then collectively they're going to vote 9 out of 10 are going to vote, hey, let's just kill this person. So the problem with democracies is it's not a fair, what am I trying to say? Your group of people that is voting, I'm really having a hard time putting this in words, may share different ideas and behave differently. So if you just so happen to have a group that, again, is gullible, they're going to make gullible type decisions based off of hearsay or whatever, right? You don't have a bunch of fact-based people checkers in this control group. It's just a bunch of feelings and emotions, and that's where it becomes a problem. So again, there are different groups of like-minded thinkers that should be grouped in one category. Category A, these people are feelers and very emotional. Category B, these people are a bit more rational, pragmatic. And then group C is a bit more theological. They're a bit more religious, so they go off of what they think their God is saying. So you have different groups that are going to think differently just based off of who they are innately, right? So if you get one too many of one group and not enough, but that group is majority, then that's who's going to rule the government in a true democracy. So you have too many people who are religious, too many people that are rational, logical thinkers, then your votes are going to be reflective of whatever majority group is there. Okay, and it very much shadows out the minority that might be genuinely trying to benefit as many people as possible. So that's the problem with a true democracy, and that's why it wouldn't really work in a modern system of fairness. The next type of government type is totalitarianism. So if you look up by definition, the Oxford definition of it is a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. So they basically expect or will enforce the public to adhere to whatever they're saying. good examples of these would be, again, North Korea would be, they're pretty damn close to that definition. I would say they're probably the closest because they try to control every aspect of someone's life. They'll control the way you think, the way you do things, what you see, what you learn. Like every aspect of your life is super controlled. If you are a citizen of North Korea and you don't know any better, because you can't, because they shut out the entire world from you, so you don't know what exists out there. You don't know that there is more than just VHS tapes, that, the internet exists. They may not know that. I am sure they don't know that. There's this whole other world that you are unaware of. They've created you to be purposefully ignorant of reality. So some people can find comfort in that because you have your government telling you everything that you need to hear. It's very much like an extreme version of religion. It's really no different. Like if the church had complete control over every aspect of our lives, it'd be the same thing. It would be pushing their agenda onto you. Oh, God says this, you think this way. You do these things. You go to church every Sunday. You don't work on Sundays. You have the weekends off. Things like that. It's very much similar to that. It's an extreme version of really anything. It's just complete control. And I'm not saying that's what religion inherently is. I'm just saying that some religious groups are very close to a totalitarianism, or would like to be. They would just love to control people and spread their message about their God or whatever. I'm not saying everyone, so don't get crazy in the comments about that. But going back to what I'm saying, though, is these people don't know any better. So they're kind of blissfully unaware of the reality. Like, to us looking in, we're like, that's very sad. They're oppressed. They're all of these things. To them, they may not really feel that way. They might just, because they have a compass, you don't have to really think. The thinking is done for you. It's a very programmed way of life, I suppose. Like pre-programmed, I should say, for you. You don't have to, like, your job is already picked out for you. Your profession, your career, your way of life. And if they got to choose who you should or should not marry, I'm sure they would do that too. I don't know if they do, but I'm sure they're probably going to get to that point if they aren't doing that already. But things like that, it's just everything's already pre-planned for you. You don't really get to create your own destiny. And again, depending on the person, they may not care. If you're blissfully unaware of the reality of things, it wouldn't matter to you. This is your environment. This is just how it is. This is how it's been. This is how it's been for generations. And so that's just the way of life. So it really just depends on perspective at that point. Like, again, for us looking in, it looks awful, and it is awful. But to them, who cares, right? Now, those who are aware, that do live in North Korea, they are obviously afraid for their life. They hate the system, all this stuff. Can they get away is the question. And, of course, some have tried. Some have succeeded. Some have failed. But ignorance is bliss, as they say, right? Those who are unaware. Anyways, that's just an example of totalitarianism at its extreme. The other subcategories of totalitarianism, according to this website, BYJU''S. I'm going to link all this stuff for you guys to look at. But the subcategories of totalitarianism is fascism, dictatorship, communism, oligarchy, and anarchy. So the other ones I want to more focus into is the oligarchies and anarchy. So getting into oligarchies. the this by definition is usually a power that is held by a few. So a small group of people having control of a country, organization, or institution. This is the Oxford definition. Usually, wealthy individuals would be the rulers of these oligarchies, or it could be a group of generals who own parts of the military branches, if not all of them. They would be included in this oligarchy. So it's not the people ruling. It's not one person ruling. It's a handful, and it doesn't really too much differ from. Well, it kind of does differ from a dictatorship, whereas like dictatorship, like these are government body individuals in the small group that are running the country, whereas like an oligarchy, you don't have to necessarily be part of the government to run it. Again, you could just be a giant corporation. And I think at the end of the day, in modern societies and governments, just about every one of us is an oligarchy. The United States, China, Russia, everyone has corporations that are running a part, if not a majority, if not all, of the government. That's just going to happen in a system that even slightly allows it. The United States, unfortunately, didn't have any contingency plans and no way to stop something like this from happening, and if that's what's happened. We do not have a constitutional republic, like is stated as by definition of the United States government. It's not that. It's just not. It's an oligarchy. All these corporations have a big piece of the pie when it comes to legislating things, passing laws, controlling certain aspects of people's lives. So, and there's evidence of that everywhere. You don't even have to like take my word for it. You just look into it. I'm sure you all know and feel that. It's just like when China and Russia put the label of we're communism. It's everyone has equal workload. Everyone's working for each other. They're helping each other out. Bull fucking shit. It's the small group at the top that control basically everything. They're the ones running it, and it's a mix of businessmen, a mix of military. It's just the elites of any type of class. So they're the ones that are ruling it, and it's infected every single government on this planet. And the reason is because that's where a lot of funding comes from. So money is power, and power is money. So when they're intertwined like that, and you allow it to influence the government, it will then infect the government to a point where it's no longer recognizable. The United States is no longer recognizable now versus 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and the differences have become completely night and day from when it was founded to now. Completely night and day. And I'm not even just talking about technological advances and amendments. I'm just talking about overall fucking corruption. It's just gotten worse. And that's what's happened, especially since the 1800s and stuff, when you start getting corporations, when industries start being created and they're not regulated properly, and we're not planning for this stuff ahead of time, so we're not putting antitrust things in place. And you can say, oh yes, there are antitrust things in place, but it's like they're not enough to stop what has happened. You can agree on that. It's just not. And I know I'm getting political, but I'm just trying to be as factually correct about what I'm saying as possible. And all this stuff is basically factual. I mean, maybe some of the stuff I said was from slight influences here and there, but for the most part, what I just said is all true. Okay, your votes really don't fucking matter anymore. It's very unfortunate, but that's just how it is. And there's evidence ever. Just look into it. So yeah, unfortunately, that's just how things are. Our founding fathers would be very upset about what has happened over the course of the United States' lifetime. But this goes for all governments. It's not just exclusive to the United States. Every government gets greedy corporations coming in and completely ruining their government because you have these sociopaths at the top, which basically who you have to be if you're gonna run mega corporations. You're basically a sociopath of some degree. Like, enough is never enough. It's always about feeding my ego and how can I get more powerful and richer by the second. So if there's and these people, the thing is these people know how to work the system because they're, again, sociopaths. They're just there to feed their ego and they don't really care about anyone else. So they have no human emotion. They're just trying to, okay, there's a giant hole here. It's not very giant, but to me it is because I see opportunity and the Constitution hasn't patched this. So if I can start infiltrating it now, it'll be too late for them to reverse. And that's what's happened. So, and that will happen to any government that is not careful about it. That leads into the next thing, anarchy. Okay, so ideally this is not a form of government that you want by any means. This is usually the collapse of one, right? The Oxford definition is a state of disorder due to absence or non-recognition of authority or other controlling systems. Typically, a collapse of government creates anarchy because they're trying to... There's groups that are trying to form, and whichever group becomes a majority, either through verbal influence or physical influence, to get their way, they then start to form what you would say is an early part of a government, whatever that may look like and turn into later. But the only way to fix the problems that have systemically infected our government and other governments, which is greed and corporations and money and sociopaths, which you can't really get rid of sociopaths. They're pretty well hidden and you usually find out about them once it's too late, type of thing. So the way to just stop this from happening again is just to start over, a civil war, basically. Now, I'm not advocating for one by any means. I want to make that very clear. I'm just saying the only real way out of an oppressed system is to fight the system, collapse it, cause anarchy, and then start over. But you're taking a risk when you do that because you might have an agenda and say, okay, my group does not like the current government, the current status quo. We want to rearrange it to what we want. So you start a civil war, government collapses. Your party might have diminished from its once original size. Now it's down half. And now there's an opposing group or groups that are actually bigger than yours after the collapse. And they want it their way. And so just because you started a revolution, just because you did all these things, doesn't mean that it's going to end up your way at the end, right? Like with Germany, when it collapsed, there was different parties, different ideas, and fascism took the lead because Hitler was a complete sociopath about it and got his way because he rigged elections, took out people that of other political parties, and basically forced fascism to be the main political party that everyone was going to vote for into being just the main form of government for Germany. That's the and no one should want an anarchy for their government unless it's super oppressive and controlled and everyone sees it. And so basically like North Korea, right? They're doing a lot of bad over there. The elites over there, they're doing a lot of bad to suppress and control their people, and they're killing people left and right just because these people don't adhere to their propaganda and agendas. If enough people in North Korea start to recognize this and they start to band together, then anarchy would be created. Well, a civil war would be created. Then, if they win, anarchy would then happen once the collapses happen. But you really don't want that because it puts your country in a very vulnerable state. That, at that point, China could start rolling in with their tanks during this anarchy and take control. Now China's got more land, which probably is what would happen for almost sure. I would say that's what would happen. Of course, United States and other countries would be like, you can't do that. You're infringing on their rights. Blah blah blah. We would push our agenda. We would just be, we don't want territorial expansion from China, which is really what we care about. We don't really care about the North Koreans and the fact that they're anarchists. We just care about not furthering the Chinese agenda. That's what we care about. Because it becomes a political game of territorial expansion and shit. Anyways, so anarchies can be bad because then you just get consumed either by a neighboring country or it just becomes another monarchy and nothing's really changed. It's just false promises, and then again you have the elites at the top. It's the same bullshit over again. And this type of thing has happened over and over and over again. If you ever read the book Animal Farm, I think it's by George Orwell. Yeah, great book. It basically goes over what I just talked about, where you have a group that feels oppressed by what you would consider the elite, the ones that have the status quo, they're pushing their agendas. And so the small group causes a civil war, they win, and then that small group that pushed this agenda of, hey, we want fairness for everyone, we want basically communism is what they were alluding to. We want this for everyone. Those same people just ended up doing what the last regime did, and was just oppress the new regime, and the elites benefit. And it's just the same bullshit that gets repeated and tumbleweeded into history. It's just a recycled thing. And it's just something we've gone through since the beginning of civilizations, unfortunately. So we still haven't really figured it out, and there's too many variables and factors that go into it that there is no real one answer to any of this. And again, I'm not advocating for anarchy or anything like that. If I would say absolutely, if our government started becoming way too controlling and oppressive, we would see it coming a mile away, because of we have been exposed to the modern world through the internet and interconnectedness, that if our government tomorrow started doing the stuff that North Korea did, it would be a very big problem. Even, again, because the way that the United States works, it's very delayed in its processes. Even if they start the process now, we would still see it coming. So if they started to try to be more like China and there's some other places where they heavily monitor us, which they already fucking do, but they start taking away certain rights that were founded upon in this country to prevent the government from doing it in the first place. If they start taking those unalienable rights away, then that's when we're going to have a big problem, because, like, hey, this is completely against what the Constitution says it's protecting us against, and you are violating that. So, time for war. That would basically be it. So, I think the United States is, yes, we've become so corrupt, but we're still better than some other countries, and there are some other countries that are way better than us in terms of trying to benefit its citizens and the majority. There are certainly countries way better than the United States, for sure. But I would say, on a global scale, we're much better than some of the other governments as well, putting it into perspective, right? You do have to think about it that way as well. But it's not to a point where it's like, oh, we should just abandon ship. Like, it's not, it hasn't become that oppressive yet, and hopefully it never does. Who really knows? It's really up to the leadership of the country to either run the empire, country into the ground, or not. It really just kind of depends on them. So we're just gonna have to ride it out and see what happens. Unfortunately, that's my biggest takes on everything. I think I basically got everything out there. To answer the question of what the ideal government is, it's whatever the hell benefits the most people almost unanimously. Almost. It's never going to be everyone is 100% going to agree on what the details and specifics of that is going to look like. I don't think there'll ever be a time, unless we are all programmed the same, unless we all have the same personality. Unless that happens, I would say it's probably never going to happen. Because we're all individual free thinkers. We all think a little differently. We can categorize like-minded thinkers into groups. And there will be similarities shared between certain groups, but people will be put in groups for a reason because they just don't think like group B or C or D. And they definitely don't think like group F, right? A to F is polar opposites, and so that's the problem that you run into. Well, either on a small scale or a large scale. Even if you're dealing with a government of 10 people, and that's all there is, versus a government of millions and billions of people. Like, you still run into the same fundamental issues of every person's different. Every person's going to want things their own way. And again, some people will agree on certain concepts with each other, but they're not all going to agree with everything. So I would say if any one of these governments that I've discussed, other than like the super oppressive ones, or governments that intentionally will cause failure or is just not set up to benefit people at all, any other government can work, right? Like I said, a monarchy could work with the right leader. A constitutional republic can work with the right set of leaders, with things that will ensure that corruption cannot take place of any form or kind. Had we gotten ahead of this curve in during the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we would not have the problems that we have today. Guarantee it. If we had nipped it in the butt then, before it became a problem, before it became systematically infected, we would be fine. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So you have to have a government body that is willing and able to deal with such corruption so that it doesn't completely turn the government on its head to do the opposite of what it was founded on, right? We try to get away from tyranny and small groups controlling bigger groups, and that's exactly what's happened again. Ideally, it's whatever that ideally I think it can look like anything. Like the perfect government could look like anything. It just depends on who's at the top, I think. The interesting thing is if we had theoretically, well, hypothetically, if we had an autocratic system, so someone who's a supreme absolute ruler at the top, and they could live forever, and they were a great-hearted, very ethical person, then you could possibly be fine forever. Same person, rolling for hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of years, you'd be fine. The only thing that you would run into is, what if he gets assassinated? You know, he might have the fountain of youth so he doesn't age and die of natural causes, but he could still die from a bullet to his head. Unless that's solved too, we're still prone to a potential anarchy of, well, if this person dies, what's the succession plan? So that's an interesting hypothetical put out there, and some of where I get those type of ideas is from Fallout New Vegas, the video game, and that game has such a great philosophical take on what the best type of government would be for the wasteland of New Vegas. There's multiple different outcomes, and since the game has been created back in 2012 or 2013, people are still debating on what the best form of government is. Just like in real life, the kind of government that I would want is, I would say, a constitutional republic, just like what we have in the United States at the early stages, but one that, again, gets rid of corruption, one that's hardened so that way it doesn't become corrupt. Because I like the idea of having power being spread amongst basically the entire population, whereas each individual person in that country or state has a voice, and enough votes can swing the tides of a law that gets passed. I just like that idea better than a autocracy with one person at the helm who is controlling everything, even if they're great, because again, it brings up succession plans of what if. Whereas if we had something like what we have now, but better, where there's multiple people controlling the inner workings of the government, and these representatives were voted in by the people, and if the people don't like them because they're no longer representing them correctly, they can vote them out, and lobbying is changed so much so that corporations can't influence politics the way that they do nowadays, and people in Congress have limited terms, so that you not have the same person in there for 60 years or whatnot. Just a little bit more control with how the Constitution's written out, so that way it prevents these things from happening and getting out of control. Like, if we could just reset the United States Constitution to rewrite it so that way those things are implemented, I would say that would be ideally the perfect government. And no outside influence can fundamentally change the government system in such a way that it's different. Ideally for me, that's what I would want: more power in hands of many than more power in the hands of the very few. No one can have the absolute right answer. So that's my answer. It's a lot of things. It's very much perspective based, very much based on tolerances, very much based on cooperativeness, and it's based on fairness for as many people as possible. That's my answer. That's it. Thank you for tuning in. You guys have a great day.